Hi guys, I'm Kasha. Welcome to the channel and welcome as always to our coffee times to discuss movies, for the most part horror movies, because those are my favorites. And today I'm here to talk to you about folk horror.
It's coffee time.
So, summer is slowly but surely coming to an end, and finally we're going to approach fall, autumn, spooky season. And honestly, for me, when it comes to September and October and November, I just really enjoy those moody, atmospheric movies. And there is something about most of the folk horror movies that tend to vibe with that. Now, not all folk horror movies are perfect for autumn. Some of them might be good for summer, but I thought, I would make two different videos. The first one is this one here today, in which I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about folk horror and where it came from, as well as give you some movie recommendations. Basically, it's just the movies that kind of shaped and created this subgenre of horror. And then my next video that is gonna go up after this one in the channel is going to be the newer movies that are folk horror movies after the 2000s, so the more new releases, even though 2000 is so long ago. It's just crazy to think about it. Let's not think about it because I'm gonna get depresso. So yeah, let's go into it. So obviously folk horror, it is a subgenre of horror that is using, myths, legends, all the folklore in order to create this fear in the viewer. The typical themes tend to be isolation, a rural setting, religion, the power of nature, and the darkness that we find sometimes in those powerful landscapes that we get to see. Because a lot of these folk horror movies, what they have in common is amazing, stunning cinematography. And I was surprised myself to find out that actually the term folk horror was not really used or established until the 2000s. It's crazy because the first horror movies that were considered folk horror, at least the trilogy, like the three movies, the holy trinity of folk horror, come from the 70s. So Piers Haggard in 2003 did an interview with Fangoria magazine, and he mentioned that one of his movies, he mentioned in that movie that it was folk horror, and that is one of the first times, if not the first time, that somebody actually paid notice that he was using that term in order to describe his film. He was talking about The Blood on Satan's Claw, which was a movie from 1971, but it is really interesting to me the fact that they didn't use the term until so later on. At least nobody seemed to notice that the term existed until then. But when the term was really kind of accepted and really introduced to everybody was in 2010, thanks to a documentary. The documentary was a part of documentary series that was called A History of Horror. So it was then in 2010 that it was really kind of established as its own term, which is just mind-blowing to me. The first folk horror movies that we considered as really folk horror that established this type of films were in the 60s and 70s, and they all happen to be British horror movies. It doesn't mean that folk horror is only British horror. There's many other countries that have been using this in their movies, especially in the recent years, and I'm really glad because I truly do enjoy a good folklore horror. A lot of movies, have been able to show us a lot of different pagan traditions, a lot of different kind of more obscure and weird rituals from their country, and it is just so great to see so many European countries embracing this and showing up some sort of myths and legends. But even though folk horror is open to every country and we kind of get stories from all over the world, they all tend to have like similar themes or similar things that they have, all of them. There tends to be some sort of summoning in a lot of them. There's some sort of pagan god or some sort of creature from the darkness that tends to be summoned or called upon on purpose or by accident. They tend to portray animism or paganism, which is basically the portrayal of a god in an animal or godlike form. They tend to also love human sacrifice, sometimes animal sacrifices. Sadly, there is a lot of animal sacrifice in folk horror, and this is mostly in order to appease, in order to kind of please the nature gods because we humans have been messing around with nature a lot. There is also a set of characters that share the same belief, so they all kind of participate in the same sort of rituals, culture, cult, club. Yeah, so it tends to be kind of like a society that has the same beliefs, whichever they might be. There also tends to be a beautiful portrayal of the landscape, of the setting. There is a special attention paid to showing beautiful like rural landscapes or like woods, and that is kind of part of what gives these movies such atmosphere. So those are some of the things that they have in common. Not all movies have all of these things, but those are elements that you are probably able to see throughout the folklore horror movies, the ones that have been considered to belong into the subgenre of horror. Now let's go to the list of movies that I would like to talk about, the ones that kind of started it all to the very late of the 1990s. So we're gonna start with the 3 movies that are considered to be the ones that were the first like folk horror movies. The first one is Witchfinder General, directed by Michael Reeves and starring none other than Vincent Price. The screenplay is based on a novel by the same name, and you're gonna hear me say that a lot because a lot of these movies have been inspired by books, at least some of the older movies more than the newer ones. The film is a heavily fictionalized account of the murderous witch hunting exploits of Matthew Hopkins, a lawyer who falsely claimed to have been appointed as Witchfinder General by the Parliament during the English Civil War. So basically his mission was to find evil, the roots of evil, to find witches and to punish them. It's really interesting because it was kind of like an exploitation thing because they would get money for as many people as they would get to confess. So it's something that it should give you chills because this movie is based on something evil that is not particularly supernatural, but it's more of a human evil kind. It's a disturbing tale of corruption and witchcraft, and I definitely recommend you guys, if you have not checked this out and you love the genre, well, the subgenre, because this is kind of the one that started it all. And it is a great study on violence, so you know that there's going to be a lot of violence as well in this movie, so you've been warned by, you know, it's one of those classics that you have to have seen. The Blood on Satan's Claw by Peter Haggers, and this is one that at the beginning it was considered to be a anthology of horror stories, I believe, but when they changed directors, then Haggard decided to put kind of like these stories together and build up just one narrative and go with it. And as I've mentioned before, Haggard said that this movie for him was a folk horror in 2003 in an interview, and I think he was the first person to use that term. When a mysterious corpse is accidentally dug up by a boy in a small town, a group of local teens start acting very strangely. Now the adolescents are convinced that this corpse is possessed, that something is inside of this body. So the teens are hoping to get in touch with the devil, and they use the corpse in order to perform some rituals, you know, hoping to be able to communicate with the one and only devil. And when word spreads in town that this is what the kids are doing, some of the parents decide to basically lock them up and be like, what are you doing? I believe this one is hard to find these days. I have not seen this movie in a very long time. I kind of wish that we would have here some sort of service where you could watch old horror movies, because I feel like a lot of people have not seen them but also have not really much access to them, which is another reason why a lot of people are unfamiliar with them. This movie is really beautiful when it comes to the visuals, and I love the way that the shots are framed. It gives him this kind of like spooky, eerie vibe. And this is a story basically of witchcraft with a touch of evil, and another one that I would obviously recommend you guys. Now let's go to one that I feel like a lot of people know, and that is obviously The Wicker Man, directed by Robin Hardy and stars among others Christopher Lee. This one is another one that was inspired by a book, and one that is a little bit crazy and over the top at times, but definitely worth your time and much better than the remake that they tried to pull. The story centers on a visit of police sergeant Neil Howie to the isolated Scottish island of Summer Isle in search of a missing girl. Howie, a devout Christian, is appalled to find that the inhabitants of the island have abandoned Christianity and now practice a form of Celtic paganism. So this guy is really like freaked out about everything that he's seeing there as a true Christian. all of these things going on, all of the rituals, the temptation with this girl, and he starts to find more and more about the people that live there and, you know, their culture, and he's also getting closer to figure out what happened to the missing girl. And we all know that this movie is a little bit bonkers, but I personally absolutely love this ending. This is part musical, part occult movie, and you know, it has still one of the most impactful and kind of surprising endings of movies, and I truly enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun with it, but it is kind of a little bit weird. The movie's a slow burner that touches on paranoia and cynicism and, you know, how far your beliefs might get you. Beliefs is something so powerful, and it's something you get to see a lot in movies that are folklore horror as well as cult movies, because, you know, if you make people believe in something, then it can get really dangerous. So now that we've established the 3 movies that kind of created that baseline for the folk horror movies, the ones that are more well known for it, let's talk about other ones that also have folklore horror. Let's talk about the Dunwich Horror, because this is an American supernatural film that was inspired by a short story from H.P. Lovecraft, and I know a lot of people don't particularly enjoy this one. It might be part of the special effects, but I also love myself some H.P. Lovecraft. I love cosmic horror, and weirdly enough, there's also folk horror in cosmic horror. The movie is about a young female graduate student who is targeted by a man attempting to use her in an occult ritual taken from the Necronomicon. And we also follow Dr. Henry that goes to this mansion looking for Nancy, a girl that went missing the day before, in order to make really gruesome discoveries in this place. I feel like you might like this more if you like Lovecraft in general, because that is what it's kind of based on. The movie is a bit of a slow burner, and it's a lot more about the atmosphere than anything else. So if that's not something that you enjoy, then I would say maybe pass on this one. It's a movie about, you know, psychedelic dreams and altars and owls and rituals. It can get a little bit crazy towards the end. So this one, you know, might be a hit or miss for a lot of people. Now let's go to a Czechoslovakian movie, and we have Valerie and Her Week of Wonders. This is a surrealist fantasy horror film, and this one is also based on a novel, and it is considered part of the Czechoslovak New Wave movement. Valerie is a 13-year-old girl that has had to move with her grandmother after she loses both her parents, and she is slowly tapping into womanhood. Now Valerie has some magic earrings. Now she sees the world around her in a different light, and Valerie is attempting to discern reality from fantasy as she encounters a lecherous priest, a vampire-like stranger, and otherworldly carnival folk. This is a very weird, I would say, coming-of-age story, and it's a movie that has some fantasy elements added to the horror. It has a really great dramatic kind of style with the saturated colors, some dramatic angles, and some deep shots framed with cobwebs and with branches, which give kind of, you know, this magical world atmosphere that makes it almost believable. Now let's go to a survival film called Walkabout, and this one, it's also in a way a coming-of-age story, and this is a very interesting one. It's also based in a novel, and it is set in the Australian outback. So the movie starts quite depressing, and I feel like this movie is quite depressing in general. We follow this father that decides to take his 2 kids and to the outback and kind of tries to shoot them, and when he fails to shoot them and kill them, he decides to turn the gun on himself. So now the kids are left by themselves alone, and they are going to have the help of an indigenous boy that is going to kind of help them survive in the wild. So this story is very sad in general, because even though the kids are being helped by this boy that knows how to survive in the wilderness, I feel like the kids at the end of the movie still are as lost as they were in the beginning, and there is no connection that gets established between the kids and the indigenous boy. Even though they kind of help each other in a way, there's still no real connection between them, which is really heartbreaking to see. Next we have one that it's more of a kind of psychological thriller directed by Ted Kotcheff, and this one is called Wake in Fright. After finishing up the school term in a remote outback town, teacher John Grant looks forward to spending his holiday with his girlfriend in Sydney, but John gets waylaid in a mining town where a gambling spree leaves him completely broke. So the movie starts very slow and we see this character struggling, and he starts to drink a lot and he starts to basically hang out with people that are a little bit questionable. The locals are kind of messing with him, doing like drinking games and stuff like that, and he's forced to participate in a hunting kangaroo kind of thing. And the movie is like, not much happens during the first like 20 to 30 minutes of the film, and then it catches up a little bit. But this is a movie that I would never rewatch, because there is a part where there is an animal hunting and killing, and it is a real thing. Like, it is not fake, it is real. And if I know this about a movie, I don't think I knew it back in the day, but if I know it, I'm not gonna watch that movie. That's just a personal choice, so I don't think I would ever rewatch this. Now we have the Australian mystery film called Picnic at Hanging Rock, and it is directed by Peter Weir. It is of course adapted by a novel, and in this case we are in the 1900s. Miranda attended a girls' boarding school in Australia, and one Valentine's Day the school's typically strict headmistress treats the girls to a picnic field trip to an unusual but scenic volcanic formation called Hanging Rock. Despite being advised not to venture off, the girls of course do, and by the end of the day they realize that the girls are missing, and so is one of the teachers. What this movie really does well is the cinematography. There are beautiful blue skies, beautiful Australian flora and fauna. It's just so beautiful to see. This movie is a very slow paced film, and it has kind of like this flair as if it would be like a dreamlike movie. But despite the film seeming a little bit simple, it is really beautiful, and I would definitely recommend you guys to give it a chance. So now we abandon the 70s and we go to the 80s, and we have Eyes of Fire, which is an American movie. Also known as Cry Blue Sky, it is an American folk horror film written and directed by independent filmmaker Avery Crowns. A preacher is accused of adultery, and he and his followers are chased out of town and become stranded in an isolated forest which is haunted by the spirits of long-dead Native Americans. You can expect mud ghosts and evil tree demons and things like that. So this one has some interesting visuals as well. They use some sort of camera tricks and filters in order, you know, for you as a viewer not to forget the things that you're seeing in this movie that at times are quite surreal. I feel like if people have enjoyed The Witch by Robert Eggers, you might enjoy this movie, because it does have a lot of like creepy hunting images and kind of like a really eerie atmosphere. And keeping with the 80s, we have a movie called The Company of Wolves, which is kind of a Little Red Riding Hood retelling. It is a British horror fantasy movie directed by Neil Jordan, and among others we have here Angela Lansbury as one of the cast members, and I remember her so much from my childhood. My parents used to watch Murder, She Wrote, and I used to watch it with them as a kid, which was great. And I always have such a fond memory of her, so this is a movie that kind of also holds a special place in my heart. I also love fantasy, like fairy tale retellings that are dark, so here is an option. Wolves and werewolves lurk throughout the dreams of young Rosaline, who imagines that she must journey through a dark forest to live with her grandmother. When Rosaline meets a ragged hunter in the woods, she discovers that she has an animal-like attraction to him, leading to a macabre turn of events. Apart from that, we also have like side stories told from Rosaline's and the grandma's perspective, so you get also like bonus stuff. It is definitely not a kids movie, and it is a movie that is trying to portray the more darker themes and topics that we get to see in the classic tale of Little Red Riding Hood. It's basically retelling it as a classic fairy tale, but with the horror B-movie flavor. Now we jump to the 90s and we have The Reflective Skin, which is an interesting tale about vampires. It is a British-Canadian horror movie directed by Philip Ridley. The director described this as a mythical interpretation of childhood. We also have here vampirism, black comedy, surrealism. Like, there is a lot of things to unpack in this movie. Growing up in the 1950s in a small town, 8-year-old Seth and his friends play a prank on the town recluse, a widow named Dolphin Blue. When his friends start disappearing, Seth becomes convinced Dolphin is a vampire, stealing the souls of the neighborhood children one by one. So Seth is now really concerned because his brother Cameron has returned home, and he establishes a friendship with this neighbor, with Dolphin, and he thinks he's gonna have the same fate as his friends and he's going to disappear, so he's determined to save his brother. This movie is quite strange, and at the end of the day I believe this is a movie that leaves more questions opened than answered. So I don't know if that is gonna please everybody, because I know a lot of people need closure by the end of the film. But this is probably one of the most like depressing, horrible coming of age stories. So this is another one that is a toughie. There are such surreal images and it has such a kind of moody, depressing soundtrack, and I feel like the visuals in this movie are fantastic, and I was not surprised to find out that actually the director of the movie had a background on painting, because I feel like you can tell. Our next movie is a movie that for sure is going to always be remembered as one of the low budget movies that was more influential and that became more popular. And I'm talking, of course, about the Blair Witch Project, which I've mentioned this before, but it's always gonna have a special place in my heart because I went to see this movie with my dad when it came out to the cinema, and we didn't know exactly what we were gonna get. My dad, bless him, he always watches all the horror movies with me. Even though he doesn't always have fun, he's not the biggest fan of getting scared. And I would never forget the ending of this movie in the cinema back when it came out in 1999. This is the fictional story of 3 student filmmakers who hike into the Black Hills near Burkittsville, Maryland in 1994 to film a documentary about a local legend known as the Blair Witch. The 3 disappear, but their equipment and footage are discovered a year later. So basically this reported found footage, recovered footage that they recorded is the movie that we get to see. Now this movie definitely rekindled the found footage subgenre of horror, and it also added a little bit the elements of folk horror into it, and this has been one of the most influential movies. You might love it or hate it, but you cannot deny that this was a very important movie for horror. The movie just felt so real, so raw, that the fact that, you know, you were in the woods alone in the dark, it is that feeling of things that lurk at night. The movie doesn't really show you things, they just make you feel them, and I feel like that is such a good thing that you can accomplish in horror if done correctly, and this movie is definitely creepy without having to show you much. And let's finish this video with Wisconsin Death Trip. I feel like this one should be more talked about because this is a docu-drama that it is just so well executed. Now a lot of people don't like the colored, like modern part of this documentary, but I feel like this is such a hidden gem that not many people know about. It was directed by James Marsh, who later on went to win an Oscar, so you know you're getting quality here. And obviously it's also based on a book, like a lot of things are, and it is also inspired by real events. The film dramatizes a series of macabre incidents that took place in and around Black River Falls, Wisconsin in the late 19th century. It utilizes silent black and white reenactment footage contrasted with contemporary color footage of the region, along with voice-over narration by Ian Holm. The story is so crazy that it's kind of really hard to believe that it was true, and I love myself a good documentary, a good kind of true crime story, so this is what you're gonna get here. This movie is full of violence, absurdity, death, and it might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I feel like if you, like me, enjoy like true crime stories, this is one that you definitely have to check. And I know a lot of people were not in love, like I said, with the footage that is from like the current footage in color, but I feel like it's quite well balanced out. Alright guys, so this was everything that I had to talk to you about in this video. It is a little bit smidgen long, but I hope that you enjoyed it. Let me know if you are aware of other classics like this ones up until 2000 that are folk horror that I didn't mention here. I would like to know, maybe there's some out there that I've been missing that I can still check out. Let me know down below if you enjoyed this video, if you want more of these type of recommendation videos with subgenres of horror specifically. And thank you guys as always so much for watching, and I hope to see you all in our next coffee time. Bye!